Welcome back to our Peace Through Strength podcast, brought to you by the American Security Council Foundation. I'm your host, Joy Votrobek, and back with me today is our senior fellow, Alan Dowd. Welcome back, Alan.
Good to be back as always. Thanks, Joy.
Thank you, Alan. And today we're going to discuss the relevancy of the Reagan Doctrine and some polls indicating that Americans are willing to support military aid to Israel, Ukraine, and Taiwan. You can find all of Alan's articles on our website at www.ascf.us. Please, I encourage you to sign up for our newsletter to continue to receive our articles and podcasts. Also, consider donating to help us to promote Peace Through Strength podcasts and all of the articles. I also want to mention congratulations to Alan, as he has co-authored a book that is available now on Amazon titled The New Security Blueprint: Rebuilding, Rethinking, and Renewing National Security.
Well, thank you for that plug. That was very nice of you, Joy. I'm proud of what we put together. One of my colleagues at Sagamore Institute, another place I'm affiliated with, another think tank, and I put that together, and there's chapters by him, Jerry Hendricks, and myself about issues you and I talk about, national security, how we're really not aligned or focused the way we need to be to deter the enemies that are around us and keep our enemies at bay. So the listeners might be interested in that. If they like our interviews, they might enjoy the book.
It certainly looks interesting to me, so I look forward to reading it. And Alan's latest article is out on our website called The Reagan Doctrine Lives. So that's what we're going to discuss today. Alan, if you could fill us in a little on what is the Reagan Doctrine.
Well, the Reagan Doctrine is, in a nutshell, basically says that we, the United States, will stand by our democratic allies, and we will send weapons and other support to democratic allies, and in his day, anti-communist, anti-Soviet forces who are trying to and working at and committed to fighting and holding back the Soviet menace. Obviously, it's easily applicable today. And this poll that you mentioned really caught my eye, and I thought it'd be perfect to write about for ASCF, given our commitment and our reflection of Reagan principles. This poll really caught my eye when it mentioned that pretty cleverly they asked Americans about supporting aid to Ukraine, aid to Taiwan, and aid to Israel, three democracies under various kinds of assault. Obviously, two of them are at war, and Taiwan is literally being menaced on a daily basis by cyber, air, and naval intrusions. And the PRC has threatened to move against Taiwan. But all three of them, and the polls found that Americans, above 55% in all three cases, support sending aid to these countries as they fight for their own freedom or try to deter an attack in the case of Taiwan. But the interesting thing, Joy, was when the pollsters then asked a second order question, which was, would you support sending aid to these countries reflecting the principles of the Reagan Doctrine related to America's commitment, kind of historic commitment to supporting democratic allies, the numbers went up when couched in the Reagan Doctrine language on all of them. Americans supported it more. And so that spoke to me. And one, it was revealing that the principles and language of the Reagan Doctrine can be effective for policymakers and organizations of influence like ASCF in persuading and convincing Americans to support our democratic allies under attack.
Yes, definitely. And I was certainly impressed and surprised by the polling numbers that you stated as well. 71% of Americans support military aid for Israel, and over 60% for Ukraine and Taiwan.
That's right. over 65% for both of them when couched in the Reagan Doctrine, and like you said, 71% for Israel. Those are big, high numbers, as you and I know, as people who follow what's happening in the country, and I know our listeners do too. Now, Americans don't agree on a whole bunch of things, but those are very sizable majorities, strong majorities that, which means to me they'll get behind. The American people will get behind this, and it seems to me that I know we may talk about it later, some of the issues really are our representatives in Congress are kind of holding things up or wrangling over other issues.
Yes. In fact, I was going to mention that we know that recently Congress has been holding back on an aid package to the Ukraine without our southern border being addressed. So my question is, do you think Americans will continue to support military aid on numerous fronts if the border is not addressed?
I think it's a good question, and the poll numbers that you and I just talked about would suggest Americans would. And by the way, the listeners, if they read that article, you mentioned where it is at ASCF website. I have all the links to the polls, which are very interesting, and they have much more deeper analysis of the polls and the language used. But it's a good question. It's a hard question. I'm not arguing with the questioner here, but I do think it might be because you're not the one who's really premising it this way. This is the argument that's being made in Congress right now and on the airwaves. I think it's a bit of a false choice. Americans can do both or one or the other. Policy making is about choices. We can't do everything. I recognize that. But we can do a lot more, and we definitely can walk and chew gum at the same time when it comes to border issues and international security and defending democratic allies in the crosshairs. But I think the jury's out, even though the numbers we just talked about with the Reagan Doctrine principles looks like Americans support it. There's a lot of other numbers that are worrisome. Other polls show that 51% of Americans say the U.S. should pay less attention to things that are happening overseas. There's literally a large block of Americans who say they support disengagement from the world. And members of Congress, have to reflect that or deal with that. I understand that. The problem I have, Joy, and I think you would too, and I think our listeners would, is, when a block of Congress says back in November, December of last year, the end of last year, we'll agree on getting aid to Ukraine, which we agree is necessary if we can come together on some border reform issues. And those border reforms are put together in a package, and then we have members of Congress saying, well, that's not good enough. That makes me wonder. That becomes a pretty cynical exercise then, and just brute kind of power politics, which that's not good for the country and America. That's frustrating. We see that on both sides of the political aisle, but that's what's frustrating to me is that there's been a deal offered, and there's now people who won't come across and keep up their side of the deal. I guess that's frustrating to me.
And we need a compromise there. Well, I mean, and like you said, we can address both issues.
Right.
So we have a separate bill for Ukraine, separate bill for the border.
Right. Now, by the way, I think if a member of Congress is opposed to aid to Ukraine, opposed to the principles of the Reagan Doctrine, this is a big and great country, and we don't agree on everything. Make your case, make your argument, and if your side wins, if you persuade enough, I understand. I think it's the wrong position, but I understand that. What I don't understand is using the border issue maybe as a bit of a screen or a game to not support aid to Ukraine. And this package that has bipartisan support, was not just aid for Ukraine, it's aid for Israel, which is like Ukraine fighting for its existence, and aid for Taiwan, which is trying. If the only way that Taiwan doesn't go the way of, doesn't experience what Ukraine has experienced is if it shores up its defenses and bolsters its defenses to the point that China, doesn't want to take the risk. So this is an important package for three, I think, important and strategic allies.
Yes, I agree with you absolutely. And I wanted to bring up, because I was in prepping for this podcast reading President Reagan's inaugural address.
Yes.
And a lot of it sounds so familiar to what's going on today, where we're seeing high inflation at home, but he stood by the principles of supporting our allies and free democracy.
Exactly. It's so well said, Joy, and underscoring it, Mark Twain said history doesn't repeat itself, but it sometimes rhymes. It certainly seems like a rhyming time right now. Just like you're saying, Reagan confronted enormous domestic and international challenges and said we were a great enough nation to deal with both of them.
Yes, just like you said, we can do both. It's just a matter of the will there.
Exactly.
So, and our podcast is called Peace Through Strength due to our incredible history and strategies that President Reagan himself adopted. President Reagan spoke a lot about, in fact, in his inaugural address, peace being our highest aspiration when he addressed the State of the Union.
Mm-hmm.
And going to where you were talking about in your article about Afghanistan, I mean, that certainly has left a bad taste in a lot of Americans' mouth, I'm sure. But between both Afghanistan and Iraq, many Americans may agree with your article where you said both President Obama and President Trump wanted to focus more on ourselves and our own nation building.
Right.
However, I would say that we're reminded every day about how important our allies are for peace in this world. Just look at freedom of the seas right now over in the Red Sea and the Houthis, and the UK is helping us in fighting that front.
Right. And you mentioned the Obama and Trump presidencies. I quote some of their rhetoric in that column that we're talking about. Elections have consequences, and the American people voted for what I would submit are two disengagers, Obama and then Trump, because, as you've mentioned and we've talked before, they thought that the pendulum had swung too far. The American people, too far in the direction of overextension, overengagement overseas. And so elections have consequences. President Obama promised to pull back, to retrench, and he delivered. And President Trump, and using sometimes remarkably same language, because the two men are so different. I actually quoted President Obama said it's time to focus on nation building here at home.
Yes.
3 years later, President Trump said we have to build our own nation and focus on ourselves. And they both delivered on that. I think maybe the pendulum has swung too far in the disengagement direction now, and I think our enemies are taking advantage, of that. You mentioned the Red Sea. There's obviously, we talk about the South China Sea a lot, and we've mentioned that today. And then there's a whole range of things that are happening in space, with Chinese and Russian activity. And then the North Koreans, which we should never forget about, are putting the Japanese and South Koreans on the high edge, given some of the things they're doing, which I think a lot of this is the result of us maybe pulling back too far or too much and underinvesting in defense. During the Reagan era, we were in the high 5%, 6%, sometimes got near 6% of GDP on defense. Throughout the Cold War, we were an average of 7% of GDP on defense. Now we're at 3%. And the threats are very similar to the Cold War. We actually have two big peer competitors, which is arguably more dangerous than when we just had one. And then we have all these other threats that are not being, in a sense, reined in or constrained by another superpower, right? The Soviets did constrain, and sometimes they didn't, which created problems, their bloc. Now we have a whole bunch of threats that are not being constrained by the other superpower. The other superpower had real fear of us because of the notion of mutually assured destruction.
Yes.
So those motivations aren't there nowadays, and so I do think we need to invest more in defense. 3% is just not enough in this threat environment, it seems to me. And I think that's being proven, like you said, in almost every corner of the world. You mentioned Afghanistan, and I think Iraq. American people certainly had engagement fatigue. Yes. But the thing about Ukraine, the thing about Israel, the thing about Taiwan, these three countries aren't asking for American men and women to go bleed for them. They're dying and fighting. They just are asking for the tools. Mm-hmm. And, you know, in the case of Russia, the Ukrainians are whittling down a peer competitor for a fraction of percentages of our defense budget. I mean, they are almost like a pencil sharpener or a meat grinder. Russia sends billions of dollars of military equipment and tens of thousands of men into this meat grinder and is weakening itself. And no Americans are being lost in that effort. All they want is defensive equipment. And Israel's a similar situation. Of course, Taiwan, we hope Taiwan doesn't have to experience what Ukraine experienced, but it will if we don't help them.
Yes. And this recent election has firmed up their stance there. So
yes, well said. They really did kind of put a finger in the eye of Beijing yet again, choosing a candidate from the party that is very much committed to staying separate and independent from, or sovereign, at least from the mainland.
Which would lead me to my final question for you is, what would you say to our listeners to encourage them to continue to support free democracies and peace instead of isolationism?
I would say I'd quote the great communicator himself. I'd remind them of what he said: support for freedom fighters is a matter of self-defense and is tied to our security. He was so matter of fact, and so he could take complex and complicated ideas, and that was why he was such a great president, because the presidency isn't just about policy making and treaty making and bill signing. It's about winning, gaining, and holding on to public support for those initiatives. And he was so good at that. I would say that we need to remember that enduring truth. And the reason that resonated with American people, not only did it make sense in 1981, 82, 83 when he preached it, but it was echoing other elements and other parts of American history. President Truman said it must be the policy of the United States to support free peoples who are resisting attempted subjugation by armed minorities or outside pressures. And President Washington said at the very beginning of the Republic, a free man who's willing to contend for his liberty on his own ground is superior to any slavish mercenary on earth. I mean, that's literally a microcosm or a snapshot of what's happening in Russia. Mm-hmm. Russia's trying to draw these mercenaries from, countries, around the world, sending them to their death. Ukraine, free men fighting on their territory, and free women on their territory, proving the power of freedom. So I just would say to our listeners that this is very much in the American tradition, what Reagan articulated in 81, 82, and it remains relevant today in 2024. And it is something that serves the national interest when we help others who are willing to fight for themselves. And that's an important thing. You and I, in 21 and 20 talked about how, was the Afghan National Army able, willing to fight for itself? I'm not going to impugn the Afghan National Army, but I will impugn the Afghan democratically elected government. It left. Mm-hmm. It left when the going got tough. Contrast that with what the elected leadership of Ukraine has done. It stood there with its people and with its military, and that made all the difference. Who knows what might have happened? Maybe the Taliban would have overwhelmed the ANA, but maybe not if Ghani had stayed there and stayed with and bolstered his U.S. trained, U.S. armed military. But when their leader left, I don't blame them for putting down their guns. I mean, I understand that. I do blame their leadership, though, and I think the fact that the Ukrainians and, of course, the Israelis are fighting for themselves, that's key. Willing to fight. Reagan said, let's help that kind of people who are willing to do that, and these countries certainly are.
Yeah, I think you brought a good point up there, Alan, is that the fatigue that the Americans were feeling are, from Afghanistan and Iraq, drawn out wars we were involved in. Where here, your polls are showing the support that Americans have for people that are willing to fight for themselves, for their country, for their freedom.
Right, and I think that's Americans. I think that may be the difference, Joe. I think you may have hit the nail on the head. That may be the difference, that the American people recognize these three nation states, Taiwan, Israel, and Ukraine, all in different levels of really self-defense crises, are willing to fight for and defend themselves, and that the American people recognize that's worthy of support. I do think also there is something to the idea that if you don't defend freedom over there, at some point it's going to the enemy's going to get closer and creep closer and closer and closer. So if you can make the enemy expend finite resources, military, economic, human, technological, over there. By the way, in a war of aggression, Ukraine didn't attack Russia, right? I mean,
right.
You and I've talked about it. We don't need to relitigate. Gaza wasn't occupied by Israel. Israel ended that occupation 14 years ago. The Hamas attacked Israel. Russia attacked Ukraine. It's the PRC that's circling Taiwan with aircraft and warships, not the other way around. So, I think sometimes you and I and organizations of influence like ASCF need to remind folks of just what the facts on the ground are. That, let's be very clear, there's clear aggressors in these three cases, and it's clear who is on the defense and who's on the side of freedom too.
Yes, and interesting, those three have been aggressors for a long time. That's
right. That's exactly right.
But to your other point, that if we don't do anything, they will start to encroach on us or see a weakness here. And I think that I'm glad to see this administration went back after the Houthis along with the UK. And it'll be interesting to see what happens with the recent drone attack there in the corner of Jordan and Syria.
It will be, and it is. We know this. The administration says it will respond. I think the incrementalism that it's engaged in has not been helpful and actually undermined deterrence. So I think these are people like Admiral Stavridis, General Keane, General McMaster have been saying for months, you have to restore deterrence with Iran. Iran's government doesn't feel threatened by the way the United States military and the United States government has been conducting itself for a while. That deterrence has to be restored, and pinpricks probably aren't enough. The delayed response to what the Yemenis are doing, which is, of course, Iran's beyond that, was not good and not effective and delayed, kind of a too little, too late situation. And now you have 3 Americans dead, which, by the way, Joy, it's just sheer luck or the effectiveness of our anti-drone and anti-missile systems that more Americans haven't been killed in Iraq and Syria, because they've conducted 163 different attacks since October, So
yes,
we're
and
very
I'm glad
lucky.
You brought that point up, and the deterrence you just said, because I was going to say, when you said about Reagan, and I think our spending was at 5% with him as far as defense,
right?
And it's 3% now. He understood the balance while he was saying that peace is like our highest attainable, what we're going for. He also understood that we need strength to have that deterrence.
That's right, and you've used those words so well and so effectively, like usual, Joy. Reagan understood what too many, and Americans can be educated on this. A good communicator could help a new generation understand this. But there's a paradox. Peace through strength is a paradox. To be unprepared for war, to pursue peace blindly brings about war. But to be prepared for war and to build up and defend your interest, your territory, your liberty, paradoxically keeps the peace, and it's historically proven. And Reagan understood that, and that's something that maybe the American people need to be a new generation, people older than you, younger than you and me,
yes,
that
yes.
need to learn.
And I actually talked to some, and I'm very surprised they are very up on what's going on. And so just to talk to them about the spending on our defense. And I know there's money to be spent in a lot of different programs, but ultimately if we're going to have a deterrence here, and like we discussed, all the different fronts that are happening across the world, we need it.
Absolutely. You need it's the primary duty of government. We have some of us say a government that's too big. That's a discussion for another episode or another podcast. But we have to recognize it's the primary duty of government to protect and defend its people, its interests, its territory, and that does cost money. We've done it on the cheap, I think, for too long. And I think a lot of Americans don't understand or realize that there are times when we have to invest more in defense to prevent war. And if we don't, the trade-off is quite dramatic. I wrote about that for ASCF a couple times over the last few years. We spent less than 1% the 10 years before World War I on defense. And then when we got involved in the war, we were spending a quarter of GDP, and we lost 120,000 men. The decade before World War II, we were spending about 1% on defense. And then when we were drawn into the war, the last power really drawn into the war, we were spending as much as 37% of GDP on defense, and we lost 400,000 men and women. So, and then we learned a lesson, right?
Yes,
we, America, we, the British, we, the West, we, the democratic world, learned a lesson. And it was, let's not do what we did before. So in the Cold War, we invested more in defense, sometimes a lot more than 5%. Some years. The Korean War period was much higher. It was up in the 10. And we did that to keep the peace. It didn't end all wars, but it prevented World War III. And it prevented the Soviets from rolling back civilization. And that's the lesson of really the last 100 years.
Well, hopefully if we can at least get back to that 5%.
Yeah. Well, it won't be easy, because there are other issues, like you said, Joy.
There are.
The border, fixing the border, defending the border, which is, by the way, a duty of government, of the federal government, which the federal government is not doing right now, which kind of makes me understand why Texas is doing what it's doing.
Yes.
But that's another podcast.
Another discussion.
But that costs money. Making sure that your parents and my parents have their Medicare, that costs money, and ensuring that a full range of things related to good government and a good orderly society. Those things cost money too. But the primary purpose of government is to protect and defend the people, interest, and territory of the nation state.
Yes, certainly, as it was founded and intended by the founding fathers.
Yeah.
And I wanted to bring up one other quote you had in your article because I thought it was good and went along with what you were saying. I think it was President Reagan here. You said, "No weapon in the arsenals of the world is so formidable as the will and moral courage of free men and women." Right.
And that's it's something he understood, and I think is being shown and put into and illustrated in places like Ukraine and Israel. And if we don't want another country to be added to that list, we should support democratic people who are in the crosshairs, and that includes those two countries and others. And some of our allies, by the way, Joy, I know you know, but I don't know if all our listeners know, they're doing they're taking us to school. They're pouring resources into the common defense. The Poles, the Japanese are doubling defense spending. Japan will become the third biggest defense spender in the world within the next 2 years, just behind China and the U.S. The polls are above 4%. The British they're actually talking about investing more, but they're riding a wave of some of the biggest investment in defense since the Cold War, and the South Koreans and the Indians. Now, India, we don't have a treaty relationship with, but they're a fellow democracy. They're devoting a lot more to their defense than we are as a percentage of GDP. If we want to make sure those and other allies don't fall into what Ukraine and Israel are experiencing, that we need to help those who are willing to help themselves. I guess that's the way to put it.
That's a great point. Very good point. Well, thank you, Alan. Any other points before we leave?
No, that's it. Always a great discussion, and I think those of us who are part of the American Security Council Foundation family, this article might be of interest to them because it's so full of Reagan wisdom.
It is. It's excellent, and it's on the front page of our website. So, to
well,
our
that's
listeners,
nice you say. I didn't say it was excellent. You did, but
it was excellent.
That's nice you say. Reagan's words are excellent. So but I think our listeners will enjoy the article.
Yes. Well, you pieced it together very well. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
To our listeners, you can find Alan's article on the front page of our website, as well as under Alan's section, and that is www.ascf.us. You can subscribe to our newsletter, and please consider donating as well. You can also follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, or what is now X, and subscribe and comment on both our YouTube and Rumble channels. Thank you, Alan. Thank you to our listeners. And please join us again next time for more Peace Through Strength podcasts.